Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today, we're going to unfortunately or fortunately bring our brief overview of World War II to a close. Obviously, we're not going to be able to go into the amount of detail necessary to tell these fantastic stories. You'll get some time in U.S. history to go into more depth here. And of course, as you know, there's infinite amounts of depth on the internet that allows you to go in and explore this stuff. So we're going to continue to focus on providing a satisfying narrative to help explain why the various sort of trends that are going to shape the end of the war are going to shape the end of the war. So here's our objectives for today. Let's dive in. Up until this point, the vast majority of fighting against Nazi Germany in Europe is happening from the Soviet Union. We talked previously about the three Operation Barbarossa and the three assaults into Germany, Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad, and how the Red Army is now pushing the Germans back and are more or less winning the war against Hitler. The Allies, of course, at least England and the United States, would like to get involved in this and are interested in expanding the fight against Germany. But attacking Hitler's Atlantic Wall defense is relatively daunting. Hitler has had a significant amount of time to build up pretty substantial defenses along the western coast of Europe. And although Stalin desperately wants a second front to be opened in order to relieve pressure on the Russians, the Allies instead are going to focus on bombing and attacking other theaters controlled by the Axis powers. Here's leaflets that the Royal Air Force is dropping on Nazi Germany, so take a moment, pause, and read, and we'll move forward. The first attempt by the Americans and British to take territory was Operation Torch. We were attacking French-controlled North Africa. As you, of course, remember, France was a puppet state of Nazi Germany at this point, and so we figured that this would be sort of a softer landing point. We could take territory away from the Axis without attacking the Atlantic Wall, and we could practice and perfect these amphibious landing techniques that would be absolutely essential going forward. We also hoped that the French would not fight particularly hard against because their loyalty to Hitler was somewhat tenuous. And as you can see here, so take a moment, pause, and read, we both test out new equipment and new strategies, and the French do not fight particularly hard for Hitler, which is not surprising to anyone. From there, we're going to launch an invasion of Italy, this sort of being the, quote, soft underbelly of the Axis powers. We invade first the island of Sicily, and then eventually the Italian peninsula itself. Mussolini, I'm oversimplifying, of course, but Mussolini is overthrown and killed. Allied forces slowly push their way up the Italian peninsula, and after the death of Mussolini, an Italian puppet state does exist allied with Hitler, and Hitler does not allow the Italians to surrender. And so fighting is going to continue, although Italy is going to be knocked out of the war, and another Italian government is going to join the Allies and declare war on Hitler. The French have been to some degree resisting. One of the things that I haven't talked about, and this is more or less an oversight on my part, is resistance in Europe to Nazi Germany. There was pretty substantial resistance, both helping Jewish people escape the Holocaust and also fighting back against the Germans. The French resistance attempted to, attack German positions, destroy supply lines, destroy infrastructure, things like that. Charles de Gaulle was the sort of leader of the French in exile. And you can see here the secret army attempting to stymie German efforts is going to undertake all of these things. So pause and read, and then we'll move on. All of this helped pave the way for Operation Overlord, one of the largest amphibious landing in human history. This is a joint British, American, and Canadian attempt to establish a beachhead in German-occupied France. There's a whole bunch of different components to this. We set up sort of a series of decoys attempting to trick the Germans into thinking that we were attacking different areas. This is a huge undertaking of men and materials. The actual assault itself had to go through all of these different layers of defenses. So pause and read all the various pieces of the Atlantic Wall. And the actual assault on D-Day was an incredibly difficult and hard-fought thing, involving paratroopers dropping down behind enemy lines, aerial bombardment trying to soften up German defenses, a naval attack, and then finally the amphibious assault on the beaches. Again, there's infinite resources out there to go into more depth on this, so feel free to dive in a deeper dive if you're interested. But the end result is, as you can read here, incredibly difficult for soldiers, but in the end, successful. We lost some significant assets and lives in taking the beaches of Normandy and getting this beachhead. But once we established a beachhead, we were able to move a pretty substantial number of troops onto the European continent and start inexorably pushing the Germans back and creating the pincer that would eventually doom Nazi Germany. We also bombed a lot of your German cities during this time period. So you should definitely take a moment and pause and read or watch stuff about the bombing of Dresden and strategic bombing campaigns, because the morality of these is very problematic. The firebombing of Dresden and the strategic bombing campaigns targeted all of these areas within Europe. And so all of these German cities and French cities and military installations were bombed with aerial assaults. The RAF, the Royal Air Force, would go in and bomb at night, and American bombers would go in during the day, and we obliterated basically every German city of note during this strategic bombing campaign. Here you can read what it was like for pilots to fly over Dresden, so take a moment, pause, and read. And in the end, it became a race to Berlin between Russian troops pushing in from the west, American, British, and Canadian troops, and then eventually French troops pushing in from the east. From the Russian troops pushing in from the east, and American, British, and Canadian troops pushing in from the west. Unlike World War I, Hitler attempted to have his troops fight to the last man. He launched his last assault, the Ardennes Offensive, not against the Russians, but against the Americans and Brits. But this Battle of the Bulge was won by the Allies. And from here on out, it was just Germans fighting to the last man. This story is utterly horrific, so take a moment and pause and read the effect of all of this on the German population. And in the end, the Battle of Berlin was some of the most brutal street fighting, as the Germans again refused to surrender, and Soviets had to go building by building, house by house, to get out German defenders and soldiers. Hitler committed suicide before he could be captured by the Russians, and Berlin fell into the hands of the Russians. The city itself was brutally sacked by Russian troops. And when the Americans arrived, the meeting on the Elbe between East and West was a relatively friendly meeting celebrating the destruction of Nazi Germany. The Germans themselves were horribly victimized by the Russians. Here's an account of what it was like to live through the sack of Berlin. And it did create some hard feelings between the two sides, especially after the concentration. And it did create some hard feelings between the two sides. The other thing that the Allies discovered after they had liberated Germany, this was of course known at the highest levels of American government, but was not necessarily known to the common soldiers, is that the German final solution to the Jewish problem was the Holocaust. Concentration camps and death camps were set up throughout Eastern Europe and throughout Germany. Jewish people taken to these camps were treated unbelievably horrifically and, in general, worked to death. And then, as the war became unwinnable for the Germans, Hitler accelerated the killing. He moved Jewish people to a series of death camps where they were simply gassed and they attempted to exterminate Jewish people within Europe. And the aftermath of this was unbelievable. European countries and the Americans felt incredibly guilty that we hadn't done more. And so there was this increasing push to create a Jewish homeland in order to provide protection for Jewish people. In the end, the UN, which we haven't talked about yet, but we'll talk about tomorrow, is going to create a partition plan for Israel. And we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about the creation of Israel next time. But just keep in mind, the Zionist movement, the push to create a Jewish homeland, is going to gain increasing strength because of Western leaders' failure to do more to stop the Holocaust. In the end, the effect of this is the Jewish population of Europe is significantly decreased, and the remaining Jewish people are relatively traumatized from this whole experience. And the Holocaust remains one of the most horrific moments in human history, where the industrial power of a state was turned against a specific group of people. And it's sort of the example of what modern technology and modern society can do and when it's used for pure evil. So we'll leave us there and then talk about the aftermath of all of this next time. So that's the fall of Hitler and the end of World War II in Europe. We'll move over and end the war in Asia next time, and then we'll spend some time after that talking about the aftermath, the creation of the United Nations, and the post-war order that emerges after World War II. So, brief overview of the end of World War II in Europe. Thank you for listening.